Well, it is a blessing to be in worship together on this first Sunday in the season of Lent. I have an announcement that I want to add to what Mike said. It's an update on our Next 90 campaign. We have, as of late last week, 327 commitments. That's about a third, or about a fourth, about 25% of the congregation who are giving units, households of the church. And we are a little over $10 million toward our $15 million goal, so we're two-thirds of the way there. But those 327 people aren't enough to get us to where we need to be. And so if you haven't had the chance yet to submit your commitment to the Next 90 campaign, we need you. We all need to be a part of this, making this happen for our church. And so there are commitment cards in the pew, and if you'll take one of those and fill it out, or you can go online and make your commitment there, that would be much appreciated so we can get to our goal by the end of this month. So we're in the season of Lent. We're beginning this series on the I am sayings of Jesus. We'll be in the Gospel of John during this season. And we'll be talking throughout the series about the Gospel of John and how it's different from the other three Gospels. Today I just want to mention a couple of things. If you think about the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what are called the Synoptic Gospels, you can lay those side by side and they pretty well line up, and they share a lot in common. The parables of Jesus. In Matthew and Luke, you have the birth narratives of Jesus. In Mark, it begins with, not with the birth, but it begins with the temptation in the wilderness. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have the institution of the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, where in those Gospels, Jesus takes the bread at the Passover meal and breaks it, gives it to his disciples and says, "Take, eat, this is my body broken for you." And he takes the cup of blessing and he says, "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." But the Gospel of John is different. That's not included in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, the sort of communion time is one of the telling stories that tells of the feeding of the multitudes. In John's case, the feeding of the 5,000. There's a young boy who has just a little bit of food, his lunch, basically, that he brings. And when Jesus asked his disciples, well, how are we going to feed these multitudes? Andrew, who seems to always be bringing people to meet Jesus, Andrew finds this kid and says, well, there's a little boy here, and he's offered his lunch, but what is that with 5,000 people? And in the hands of Jesus, it's enough. It's in the context of that event that Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. And it's that I am saying of Jesus that we're thinking about today. The Gospel of John doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus. It doesn't begin with the temptation in the wilderness, but the Gospel of John begins at the beginning. And in the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, which is the translation of the Greek word logos. It's a philosophical concept that John picks up on. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything that was made came into being through the Word. And then he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And he's talking about Jesus. So that's how John begins. And the calling of the disciples, Jesus asked a couple of the disciples of John the Baptist, what are you looking for? What are you looking for? And that's a question that sort of echoes throughout the Gospel of John. And John has these 7 I am sayings of Jesus that in one way or the other answers that question. And the first one is, I am the bread of life. What are you looking for? And one of the answers is the bread of life. In fact, just a little bit earlier, when Jesus first says, I am the bread of life, he says, I am the living bread. And you eat of this bread and you'll never be hungry again. You'll never be thirsty again. It fills something in you. Now, all of us know, we've been around long enough, almost everybody in the room, to know that there are a lot of things we do and a lot of things we strive after that don't really satisfy ultimately. They don't really fill what someone has called the God-shaped void in our lives. They don't fulfill the hunger that we all seem to naturally have for connection with God. And so this image of the living bread is an image that speaks to that. I am the living bread, Jesus says, the one who can fill that. The British writer Evelyn Underhill says that we spend too much of our time conjugating three verbs: I want, or to want, to have, to do. To want, to have, to do. But she says the most important verb we too often neglect: to be. To be a child of God. To be in the presence of God. To be with one another. To be and to allow Christ to fill us. What are you looking for? Jesus asked those two disciples. I think about I can just hear Bono singing, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for, the U2 song. And that song speaks of searching and running and climbing, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. This I am saying of Jesus really proclaims what those two disciples discovered. Jesus is the one that we're looking for, who fills us at our places of need. So that's the good news of our faith. It is in the context of the kind of communion story in the Gospel of John that we have those words of Jesus. And we come to the Lord's table to remember the living bread, the bread of life. We can find ourselves searching in all sorts of places, and this is nothing new. The writer of Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, is the Hebrew name, the teacher, the philosopher, the writer of Ecclesiastes, penned these words centuries ago. So this kind of seeking is not anything new. I want to read some of his words to you to remind you. This is from the 2nd chapter of Ecclesiastes. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them with all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and of the provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and delights of the flesh, and many concubines. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. But listen to the last sentence. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. That word vanity in the Hebrew means a mist, vapor. I mean, it's there for a moment, and it's not really substantial, and it's gone. And as he looks back over all that he has done, do you hear it? There's something not there. It's everything is temporary. It hasn't lasted, and there's this desire for something more. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life, the living bread come down from heaven. And whoever eats of this bread will never be hungry and never be thirsty. Augustine said, our spirits are restless until they find their rest in you, O God. Our souls are hungry until we find our nourishment in Jesus. I am the bread of life. Jesus defines his mission in the Gospel of John in a way that he doesn't define it in the other Gospels. In fact, John defines the mission of the Gospel in a way that the other Gospel writers don't. He says that these words are written so that you will believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and believing you will have life in his name. Life, that's an important word for John. But Jesus defines his mission in a similar way. He says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Abundant life. Eternal life is another term that the Gospel of John uses, and by that it never means something that happens after we die, and it's only about quantity, but it is a quality of life. It's this abundant life that we can enjoy now and in the life to come. And so we come to the Lord's table in a few minutes with hope and with expectancy, knowing that it is Christ who fills us when we open our lives to him. I want to close with a story that James Cleland, who was a Presbyterian pastor of another generation, tells the story of when he was a child, and the pastor would say, will the ushers please bring the elements forward? He thought, the pastor said, will the ushers please bring the elephants forward? And he said, as a kid, I looked around with great expectation and hope that elephants would be coming into the sanctuary. I wondered why, but I still was excited. And they didn't come. Every time we had communion, the pastor would say, will the ushers bring the elephants forward? And they didn't come. He said, I'll never forget the Sunday when I understood the word for the first time. I heard it, and I hadn't heard it before. Elements, not elephants. And he said, my hopes were dashed. All that excitement and expectancy gone. He said, I was depressed. But then he said, over time, I recovered hope and expectancy about the Lord's table, about Holy Communion. We come to the Lord's table with hope and expectancy. Hope because we know God is trustworthy. Hope and expectancy because we expect not to be filled with a little piece of bread and the juice, but to be filled with the presence of Christ as we remember all that God has done for us in him. And so in a moment we come to the table to receive these symbols that remind us of the living bread. And as we receive that living bread, we will not hunger and thirst again. Amen.